6:47 a.m. September 26th, 1396. The banks of the Danube. Outside the fortress of Nicopolis, the sound you hear is not thunder. It is the rhythmic, wet impact of steel meeting flesh, repeating every 4 seconds with mechanical precision. You are kneeling in cold mud, stripped of your armor, stripped of your clothes, stripped of everything that once made you a lord of France. Your hands are bound behind your back with rope that has already cut into your wrists. Ahead of you stretches a line of 3,000 men. Knights, counts, the sons of dukes, the finest bloodlines of Western Europe, waiting their turn. 40 yards up the slope, Sultan Bayezid I is drinking. He is not celebrating, he is administering. He has ordered the execution of every prisoner, and the process is being carried out with the cold efficiency of a slaughterhouse. The executioners are not stopping out of mercy. They are stopping because their arms are failing. A massive Ottoman soldier, covered in crimson up to his elbows, staggers backward. His muscles have seized from the physical labor of decapitating hundreds of men in succession. He drinks, gasps, and hands his weapon to a replacement who steps forward without hesitation. This is not warfare. This is disposal. This is the morning after the Battle of Nicopolis. In just 14 hours, the Ottoman Empire has not merely defeated the last great crusader army of medieval Europe. They have physically dismantled the age of chivalry, one neck at a time. The question that echoes across 6 centuries is devastatingly simple. How did 20,000 Ottomans trap-crush and annihilate a force that Western chroniclers claimed could hold up the sky with their lances? To understand why those men were kneeling naked in the mud, we must examine the glittering delusion that brought them there. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Narrate Hist Arena. We share the best history videos ever. 4 months earlier, in May of 1396, this army looked less like a military force and more like a traveling carnival of wealth. They called themselves the Golden Army, and the name was not metaphorical. The Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Bold, had spent 700,000 gold francs, the equivalent of an entire kingdom's annual revenue, outfitting his knights in custom armor, velvet surcoats, and silk pavilions. They brought wagon loads of the finest vintages from Burgundy. They brought pastry chefs. They brought hunting dogs with collars, worth more than a peasant's lifetime earnings. They brought women, courtesans dressed as lavishly as noble women, to warm their tents at night. They treated the march east not as a tactical campaign against a military superpower, but as a glorious hunting expedition where the prey happened to be human. The commander of this spectacle was Jean de Nevers, the 24-year-old son of the Duke of Burgundy. He was brave, extraordinarily wealthy, and possessed absolutely zero experience in high command. He was given leadership not because he was qualified, but because his father wanted to elevate the family brand. These men were the superstars of the 14th century. They believed that heavy armor and noble blood made them invincible. They believed war was about individual heroism, who could charge the furthest, strike the hardest, and collect the most glory. They looked at the Ottoman Turks and saw barbarians. They were catastrophically wrong. While the French knights polished their gilded breastplates, the Ottoman Empire was perfecting the science of destruction. Sultan Bayezid I was not the caricature of a lazy Eastern ruler that French propaganda imagined. His soldiers called him Yildirim, the Thunderbolt. This was not poetry, was a tactical description in an era when armies moved at the speed of an ox cart. Bayezid moved at the speed of terror. He was infamous for forced marches that covered impossible distances, appearing outside the gates of a city before defenders knew he had left his capital. He understood a truth the French nobility could not grasp. In war, time is the only resource you cannot replace. In September 1396, Bayezid had one prize in his sights: Constantinople. The ancient capital of the Eastern Roman Empire was a shadow of itself, effectively an island in an Ottoman sea. Bayezid had clamped a blockade around the city, slowly strangling the last breath out of the Byzantine Empire. He was sitting in his command tent outside the legendary Theodosian walls when messengers arrived from the west. A massive army, a forest of spears, was gathering in Hungary. They were coming for him. Most rulers would have panicked. Bayezid pivoted. He immediately lifted the siege of Constantinople, a decision that would buy the Byzantine Empire another 57 years of existence, and turned his war machine west. He summoned the full weight of his empire from the Anatolian plateau to the Balkan mountains. The call went out. He assembled the Sipahis, the landed cavalry who fought for their estates. He gathered the Akinci, the irregular raiders who spread chaos ahead of the main force. And most critically, he mobilized the Janissaries, the Sultan's personal shock troops, Christian-born children raised from youth with singular purpose, absolute obedience and absolute lethality. The Thunderbolt began moving toward the Danube at terrifying speed. Standing between this approaching storm and the rest of Europe was one man, King Sigismund of Hungary. If Bayezid was the hurricane, Sigismund was the meteorologist who could see it coming but could not convince anyone to evacuate. Sigismund was the King of Hungary, the frontier state of Christendom. He did not have the luxury of romanticizing the Ottomans. He fought them every year. He knew their tactics intimately. He knew that a heavy cavalry charge, the favorite maneuver of Western armies, was useless against the fluid, enveloping style of Turkish warfare. When the French knights arrived in Buda, the Hungarian capital, in July of 1396, the culture clash was immediate and toxic. Sigismund looked at these peacock knights, strutting in heavy steel, bragging about chasing the Turks to Jerusalem, and felt cold dread settle in his stomach. He proposed a strategy of caution. Let the Ottomans come to them. Use the Hungarian light cavalry to harass and tire the enemy. Force Bayezid to fight on terrain of their choosing. The French laughed at him. Marshal Jean, the second Le Mangre called Boucicaut, reportedly declared, "If the sky were to fall, we would hold it up with our lances." To the Duke of Burgundy's son and his entourage, Sigismund was a provincial king, terrified of a rabble of barbarians. His caution smelled like cowardice. They effectively hijacked the crusade from the man who actually knew how to win it. As the Golden Army moved south through the Balkans, the fantasy of a holy quest dissolved into a reality of indiscriminate violence. They were marching through the lands of their allies, Orthodox Christian Bulgarians, desperate to be liberated from Ottoman rule. But the French knights did not see allies. They saw schismatics. To the rigid Catholic mindset, the Orthodox Christians of the East were barely better than the Muslims. Sigismund rode back and forth, pleading with them to stop. He explained that these people would provide food and logistics. He explained they were destroying their own supply lines. The French shrugged. In their minds, peasants existed to serve nobility, regardless of which king they bowed to. The defining moment of this moral collapse occurred at the fortress of Rahova on September 12, 1396. The Ottoman garrison, vastly outnumbered, negotiated a surrender. They agreed to open the gates in exchange for safe passage, standard practice in medieval warfare. By the codes of chivalry these knights claimed to uphold, that would have been the end. When the gates opened, the Crusaders did not march in to occupy. They rushed in to slaughter. They massacred the surrendered garrison. They turned on the town. The sack of Rahova spared no one. This news traveled. Survivors carried the story south, straight to Sultan Bayezid. If Bayezid had any hesitation about how to treat these invaders, Rahova erased it. In the medieval understanding of warfare, mercy was transactional. By slaughtering a surrendered garrison, the Crusaders had signaled this was a war of extermination. They had signed their own death warrants in Bulgarian blood. The army arrived at Nicopolis on September 12th, expecting the fortress to fall like Rahova. Did not. Nicopolis was commanded by Dogon Bey, a veteran who had stocked the city with provisions and reinforced the walls. When the Crusaders arrived, they discovered a critical oversight. They had forgotten the siege engines. In their arrogance, they hadn't brought heavy equipment. They had assumed the Turks would run. They decided to starve the city out. But siege warfare requires digging trenches, building latrines, maintaining constant watches. The French had no interest in manual labor. They set up their luxurious camp and returned to feasting. For 12 days, they held banquets, while Dogon Bey watched the smoke of their celebrations rise into the sky. Every night, he sent runners slipping through the Crusader lines, carrying messages south. Hold on. I am coming 8:34 p.m. September 24th, 1396. A Hungarian scout stumbled into the French command tent, breathless with terror. The Ottoman army was not fleeing to Egypt. It was 6 hours away. The French initially accused him of lying. When reality finally penetrated their denial, the wine was abandoned. The laughter died. Then they saw the hills surrounding Nicopolis begin to glow with thousands of Ottoman campfires. Bayezid had marched his army over 200 miles in record time, moving infantry as fast as cavalry. The Thunderbolt had struck. The Crusaders were still wiping dinner grease from their chins. 5:15 a.m., September 25th, 1396. The war council that would determine the fate of 20,000 men became a catastrophe of ego. Sigismund explained Ottoman tactics precisely. Bayezid always placed his weakest troops in front, the Akinci skirmishers, to absorb the initial charge and tire the enemy. Behind them would be sharpened stakes to break cavalry momentum. Only behind those stakes waited the real army, the Janissaries and the Sipahi heavy cavalry. Sigismund proposed letting his Hungarian infantry advance first to clear the skirmishers and dismantle the stakes. Then the French heavy cavalry could deliver the killing blow against the exposed Ottoman centre. Philippe of Artois, the Constable of France, exploded with rage. The King of Hungary wishes to have the honour of the day. We will not bring up the rear. We will take the front, as is our right. Sigismund pleaded, "If you do this, we will lose the day." But in this culture, being called a coward was worse than death. The rational voices were silenced. The council broke in chaos. The French formed their own lines, approximately 10,000 men, and prepared to attack the entire Ottoman army alone. Sigismund watched them go. He had built this coalition, raised the funds, marched the army. Now he watched its spearhead aim for a cliff. 7:22 a.m. September 25th, 1396. The first minutes were intoxicating glory. The French slammed into the Ottoman skirmishers with the force of an avalanche. The Arkinci were light irregulars, barely armoured. They stood no chance against the kinetic energy of heavy cavalry. The knights screamed victory cries as they cut through the first line. To them, this was validation. Sigismund had been wrong. The Turks were weak. Then the horses stopped. Hidden in the grass were thousands of sharpened stakes driven into the earth at chest height. The momentum of the greatest cavalry in Europe died instantly. The charge became a traffic jam. From behind the stakes, the Janissary archers opened fire. Ottoman composite bows punched through mail and found the weak points in plate armour. The real targets were the horses. The French made a decision that sealed their fate. They dismounted. Thousands of men, encased in 60 to 80 pounds of steel plate, slid off dying horses into the mud. They drew swords and began hacking at the stakes. They were no longer cavalry. They were the world's heaviest, slowest, and most exhausted infantry. They fought uphill. Inside their armour, temperatures exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit. They were cooking themselves alive. After an agonizing climb, they reached the plateau. The Janissaries scattered. Jean de Nevers must have felt triumph surge through his burning lungs. They had done it. They had broken through. Then the ground began to shake. The Ottoman heavy cavalry reserve, tens of thousands of mounted warriors, crested the ridge like a silver tide. The French were on foot, exhausted, isolated. The slaughter began. 11:30 a.m. September 26th, 1396. Bayezid sat on his throne of wood and watched the heads accumulate. A French knight named Jacques de Helly had been forced to walk through the lines, pointing out which prisoners were wealthy enough to be ransomed. Jean de Nevers was pulled from the line. Marshal Boucicaut was spared. A handful of nobles, whose families could pay fortunes, were set aside. The rest, 3,000 men, were executed over the course of 7 hours. Only when his advisers warned that the scale of killing might offend God, or more practically waste valuable slaves, did Bayezid raise his hand. The survivors, mostly young boys, were marched to Anatolia to become the next generation of Janissaries. When the first rumors reached Paris, the court threatened to drown the messengers. How could the invincible French knights be annihilated? It was impossible. But as skeletal survivors trickled home over the following months, silence fell over Europe. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Narrate Hist Arena. The age of chivalry had not faded quietly. It had been executed on the banks of the Danube by a man who understood that war was not a game of honor, was a calculation. The French had failed the mathematics of survival. History does not forgive arrogance. It simply records the cost. 20,000 men paid that cost in 1396, and their ghosts still whisper the same warning across 600 years. The enemy you underestimate is the enemy who will bury you.